Okay, so what are some of the benefits of globalization? And I'll just give you a few examples. We talked about Nike before, how they have this very standard advertising campaign all over the world. And that standardization, those economies of scale, those lead to cost reduction. Another example of this kind of globalized advertising is ExxonMobil. Um, you know, gas has different formulations throughout the world, but the actual business use of it, the pumping of the gas, is very, very similar wherever you go. So ExxonMobil have this statement called, this advertising campaign called "Tiger in Your Tank." Another example is the Dove campaign for Real Beauty. So if you go to the Dove website, you will see, quite a feminist brand image, telling people that they should be, not overly superficial when it comes to beauty. Now, as people have pointed out, this was Unilever. Unilever also had the brand Axe, which had a very different, slightly sexist, advertising strategy. But the whole point is that with increasing, consumer convergence, there is this opportunity to create global brand statements. Now, enhanced kind of consumer preference. There's kind of I'll give you an example of that. Is I found a nice YouTube video with like lots of over the top product placement in movies. So if you have a movie that's shown all over the world, it shows American products. People get to hear about those products even if they don't necessarily have access to them. So this constant kind of reinforcement with brands from all over the world means that we have this degree of consumer preference that is in place for a product even before the product kind of reaches the market. And globalization, again, global marketing can lead to increased competitive advantage. So my kind of example here is Procter and Gamble, and this is the book example. It's quite a nice example how they were developing a washing powder, and in Germany they had developed like environmental friendly whitening technology. In Ohio, US, they did a builder that prevented dirt sticking to clothes, and in Japan, because people wash their washing in kind of relatively tepid water, they found something for removing stains in tepid water, and putting them all together gave very much a winning product. However, things are not perfect. As we found with Target in Canada, sometimes you do have to adapt. You do have to adapt to local culture. The same product is not going to work everywhere in the world. Just look at the difference, as we talked about in the Honda case, the difference in car preferences between, say, for example, Europe, where gas prices are double the price, people have smaller homes, smaller garages, and people tend to travel shorter distances than in the US. So we have this whole host of trade-offs, product standardization versus product adaptation. When we have a market strategy, do we have a global strategy, or do we incorporate a degree of localization? For example, with McDonald's localizing their marketing and localizing their menu a little bit for different conditions. Do we aim for having a very globally integrated corporation with maybe central marketing, central operations, central supply chain functionality, or are you more distributed? If we have a local customer service advisor, say in a small country in Asia, say for example Malaysia, they can respond to local conditions much better than a globally centered kind of customer service or marketing department. And again, another one, scale versus sensitivity. Do we want economies of scale, or do we want products that are sensitive to local needs? Now, not every product needs to be standardized to the same degree, and the degrees of product standardization will depend on the type of product. And I'll just show you, somehow they're not showing on the slide, so I'll just show you those figures. Okay, so here's 8.3. And this is basically just saying that all aspects of the 4Ps, all aspects of a product, the product, place, price, and promotion are not necessarily globalized to the same extent. What's this, the extent of world coverage? Well, imagine we have a product such as Folger's coffee or a car. That product, any country that we want to sell in, we have to have that product in the country. So it has a high degree of coverage, and we may have some adaptation, but a lot of products tend to be quite globalized. Now, the pricing strategy, we might actually set the price by region. So we might only have the pricing functionality in a few different countries. Advertising and packaging are a little bit more localized. We might advertise slightly different to high context versus then low context cultures. Different countries may have slightly different packaging needs. For example, UK would have probably slightly smaller food sizes than the US. Now, distribution will depend very much on the local conditions. And sales promotion is going to be actually very localized because we're dealing, with culture, with communication between individuals. So the sales promotion will often be very localized. And here's a list of products, and we're going from the most localized to the most universal. And the book's got some really, really weird examples here. I'm not quite sure why boxer shorts are quite so localized. But generally, food products tend to be quite localized. Things to do with design, things to do with taste. Then we have language localization. Obviously, an iPhone is an iPhone is an iPhone, but there's a degree of language adaptation. Then we have the size and the packaging. As I said, food sizes in the US tend to be larger than in other countries, the UK. Then we have technical adaptation. Most countries have slightly different electricity systems. We might have slightly different kind of 5G cell phone standards. Then we get to the application. Again, most people have very similar smartphone needs all over the world, but you may have more corporate users in one country, and you may have people who use smartphones more for leisure in another country. And even some of these are the ones the book says has no adaptation. I'm sure there's different. A watch is almost a fashion product, so you could put it down here. A motorcycle, again, that might be adapted for certain markets. I would probably want a more environmentally friendly motorcycle in the UK. I guess a piano, but again, smaller houses, you might want a smaller piano. So I will avoid asking questions about, how a localized or universal product is, because it's kind of quite, subjective. And each of these product classes, we have, what actually is important. So in culture, it's the product concept. We must modify the marketing, the technology, and the application. But I'd actually ignore that last section because, again, it's a little bit confusing. Just think a little bit about the scale and think about, the products you use and love, and just think how local to global those products would be. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about the interface between the research and development, operations, and marketing. And I'm going to kind of give a few examples. Okay, so let's look at the operations marketing interface, and let's look at some concepts that occur at this interface. So operations, this is kind of another word almost for supply chain. This is like production operations. How do we get the products from A to B? How do we do our manufacturing? So let's just start off with core component standardization. So a good example is actually the book example, where we have Seiko watches, and there's probably like hundreds of different, if not thousands of different watches. So we have hundreds of watches. but they share just a few kind of components. So they share components. Another example of this is that I used to do a bit of software development, and software is often kind of componentized. For example, I could develop software for a calendar, and that calendar software could be shared in lots of different kind of software products. You know, you'll notice that a lot of software products look similar, and that's often because they're sharing kind of similar components. Okay, so product design families. So the example, I'll use the book example. This is like Toyota. We'll notice that the Lexus, the Camry, the Avalon, and the Corolla have the same manufacturing platform. So they share a platform. So the idea is these cars share a lot of components, so we can have one single platform with some minor adaptation. Now, we can also have a universal product with pretty much all features shared. So if we think of this, maybe an iPhone is going to be the same all over the world, but there might be, say, for example, minor feature or language adaptation. And the final one, we could have a similar product, but we could have different positioning. Again, the book example is pretty good here. So we have an Accord, Honda Accord, and that's marketed as a family sedan in Japan. A commuter car in the US, or I guess they have a souped-up version. We have a low-end sports car in Germany. Okay, so that's the that's kind of the Honda Accord. Okay, so next up we have the kind of, we've already talked a little bit about the operations and marketing interface. I'll talk a little bit about these other two interfaces, the research and development and operations, and the marketing and R&D. And we'll do it in this slide. So let's just take a clip of this slide. Okay, so let's imagine that we have a gaming console. And, you know, we have a new console maybe every 6 to 7 years. You know, and the design team will want new features. So we want, you know, improved graphics, faster processors, so we will produce kind of a spec for the manufacturers, and then the manufacturers would have to put it together. And they, you know, they've got to ask, how does this fit together? How do we get all the components into this standard case? And also we have the marketing and R&D, because the idea is the marketing is close to customers. So maybe the customers find the design clunky. You know, or they find there's like a blue screen of death when it gets too hot. they can kind of pass on, you know, some kind of pass on consumer complaints. And give suggested solutions. Because even, you know, even if a marketing person doesn't understand chips, they probably understand enough about design to be able to give solutions. And at the kind of more extreme there, they can work with customers for the customers to suggest design changes in what we sometimes call customer co-creation. Okay, so that kind of explains some of the interfaces. So next up, we're going to talk a little bit this kind of topic of regionalization. And this is, how does one region affect another region? So the first one is cross-subsidization of markets. And I'll illustrate these by examples. So Michelin and Goodyear are tire manufacturers. Michelin is based in France. Goodyear is based in US. And each has their home markets, and each will use revenue from their home markets to kind of cross-subsidize other markets. And another good example of this is the Times newspaper. News International own Fox News. They also own a lot of other media companies throughout the world. And basically, the Times newspaper is one of the big broadsheet newspapers in the UK. And they were basically, they weren't the biggest seller in the market. So News International just sold the newspaper below cost at half the price of the other newspapers in order to build market share. So they cross-subsidized the UK market with revenue from other markets. And it's the same with the supermarkets. I've talked a lot about this, so I won't spend too much more time. You know, Walmart, Tesco, and Carrefour, they're all trying to build in different areas of the world, and they will cross-subsidize with revenue from their own markets. Okay, so now weak market segment. What's a weak market segment? So Honda, the US had some very traditional motorcycle groups like Harley Davidson, and they produce big kind of chunky motorbikes. But you know, come the 1970s, with increased gas prices, there was a need for smaller, more fuel-efficient bikes for people wanting to get about town. So this is one of the original older Honda motorcycles, and Honda basically identified none of the US competitors produced anything like this, so this was a weak market segment in the US. So Honda could use this to move in to the US. Again, this was, McDonald's trying to introduce drive-through restaurants in Asia, increasing car use in Southeast Asia, but restaurants hadn't really kind of, caught up with this and the people using cars. So this was a weak market segment, and McDonald's saw, a degree of opportunity in the market. So here we go. This is just advertising Malaysian consumers how to use drive-through restaurants. And wireless, if you think of 4G phones, 4G was actually in South Korea and Japan, was very much ahead of the US or the European markets. So again, companies like Samsung could innovate in these markets and then change to kind of some of that technology into the other markets in the world. So here, East Asia was a leader in wireless. High-speed trains. France and Japan have integrated high-speed train networks. So we kind of they're the lead market in those. And in fact, when high-speed trains have been introduced, or quite often new trams have been introduced in the US, then it's European companies providing the vehicles because they are kind of the leaders in the market. Okay, so finally, we have our competitive analysis. And a competitive analysis, or a SWOT analysis, is we're trying to identify a company's strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And then we're going to use this to formulate some new strategies. So I think the best way to do this is by example. And so this is a SWOT analysis. And this is how it's laid out. We have our strengths, our weaknesses, opportunities, threats. And then from that, we can develop new strategies. So let me make this a little bit bigger, and then I will do the example. Okay, I just wanted a little bit more room there. So we're going to actually do Starbucks, and I will do a SWOT analysis for Starbucks. So let's just start off with what are Starbucks' strengths. Well, we have a strong global brand. People have heard about Starbucks all over the world. It's known for a consistency of products. And it's known for kind of having high quality generally. What are its weaknesses? It's a little bit staid and corporate. It's not cheap for what it is. It's kind of quite, relatively expensive brand. And one thing I've noticed is that, you see a lot of Starbucks on the outskirts of cities, but it doesn't, quite often, it doesn't have the premium locations. So not premium locations, except maybe in certain places like New York. But a lot of places, particularly where it's expanded, it hasn't got those premium locations. It's got a lot of like out-of-town shopping malls. What sort of opportunities does it have? Well, there's a growing need for coffee. There's a growing need or desire for coffee. Starbucks, you can think of it really as a middle class brand. It's not high end, it's not low end. So this growing middle class in developing nations. And the fact that we are this global brand, the fact of kind of consumer convergence is going to help us. And what are the kind of threats? Well, we have, other global competitors. I mean, there's one in the UK called Costa Coffee. I don't think that's a huge threat. So I'll just call it Costa. And funnily enough, that's actually that's been purchased by Mars. So that's actually been purchased by a major US corporation. So that could be a competitive if they kind of want to move into the US market. We've also got, the lots of small boutique coffee shops, which people may prefer for being more individual and less corporate. And at the low end, in a way, they've been kind of squeezed a little bit, Starbucks, because at the low end, we have like, Dunkin' Donuts have tea and coffee. So similar kind of chains have tea and coffee. So the thing is, Starbucks have suffered in the last recession. They were being squeezed by the boutiques from one coffee shop from one end, and Dunkin' Donuts and McDonald's, where you can buy a coffee at the other end. So what could they do? So as a strengths and opportunities, they could maybe expand aggressively to the middle class in Asia. So what's the strengths and threats? Well, they've got to compete with, Dunkin' Donuts and other competitors. So maybe advertise, the Starbucks experience. Almost, why are we better than other shops? So that would be more kind of improving our brand and brand image. So what would be, sorry, weaknesses and opportunities. Well, our weaknesses is we're kind of pretty corporate, so why not expand more to corporate offices? You know, we take advantage of our weaknesses there and begin to expand it. We see it as an opportunity, but it's also a weakness. And then the weaknesses and threats. We're being hit by these companies all around. It's almost similar to the strengths and threats, but rather advertising our advantages, we'll maybe do lots of kind of coupons to get these more price conscious, these price conscious consumers in. So again, it's quite hard to do this on, but there will be at least a few SWOT questions in the exams. You know what a SWOT is, but in terms of actually making strategy, you could probably make an argument against some of my categorizations here. So a lot of this, is based on personal preference. But this will actually I'll think about putting this in the homework because this will actually make a nice homework question. Okay, so that's all for this week.